For 15 years, Michael Harris treated his blind father with nothing but irritation and impatience. He sighed loudly when his father moved too slowly, spoke harshly when he needed help, avoided visits whenever possible. Michael saw his father's blindness as a burden, an inconvenience in his busy, successful life. He never asked how it happened, never wanted to know the details. It was easier to assume it was just bad luck, just another problem he had to deal with. But when his aunt finally broke her silence and revealed the truth about why his father lost his vision, Michael's entire world shattered. Because his father wasn't blind due to an accident or disease. He was blind because he made an impossible choice, a sacrifice so profound that it would haunt Michael for the rest of his life. And the worst part? His father never told him, never wanted him to know, never expected anything in return. Before we continue with this heartbreaking story, do me one favor. If you believe in second chances, if you've ever taken someone for granted, or if you just want to know how this devastating truth changed everything, hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, pause for 2 seconds and subscribe, because you're about to hear a story that will change how you see your own family. Let's get into it. Michael Harris had always been a busy man. At 35, he ran a successful consulting firm in downtown Chicago, drove a luxury sedan, lived in a pristine suburban home with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children, Emma and Josh. His life was meticulously organized, efficient, productive. There was no room for inefficiency, no patience for things that slowed him down. And his father, David Harris, had become exactly that. An inefficiency, a slowdown, problem to manage. David was 62 years old and had been blind for 15 years. He lived alone in a modest apartment across town, getting by on a small disability pension and Social Security. He had been an engineer before losing his sight, a respected professional with a promising career. Now he spent his days navigating his small apartment with practiced movements, listening to audiobooks, waiting for the rare visits from his son. Those visits had become increasingly infrequent. Once a month, maybe. Sometimes Michael would go 2 months without seeing his father, always with an excuse. Work was busy. The kids had activities. Jennifer wasn't feeling well. Traffic was bad. There was always something. When Michael did visit, the irritation was palpable. He would walk into his father's apartment and immediately feel his jaw tighten. The place was clean but dated, filled with the quiet darkness of someone who couldn't see to update the decor. David would greet him warmly, his face lighting up at the sound of his son's voice, his hands reaching out for an embrace. Michael would offer a brief, stiff hug and then sit down, already checking his phone. The conversations were painful. David would ask about work, about the grandchildren, about Jennifer. Michael would give short, distracted answers. When David would fumble for something, take too long to find the remote control or struggle to pour coffee, Michael would sigh audibly, that sharp exhale of impatience that cut through the air like a knife. "Dad, just let me do it," Michael would say, his voice tight with frustration. "You're taking forever." David would smile apologetically, that sad smile of someone who knows they're inconvenient. "Sorry, son. I'm still getting used to where everything is. You've been blind for 15 years, Dad. You should know by now." The words were cruel, but Michael never seemed to notice. Or maybe he did notice and didn't care. He was too busy, too stressed, too focused on his own life to consider his father's feelings. Jennifer would sometimes try to talk to him about it. "You're really hard on him, Mike," she'd say gently after a particularly tense visit. "He's doing his best. He's slow, Jen. Everything takes him 3 times as long as it should. I don't have that kind of time. He's your father. And he's blind." "Exactly. He's been blind for 15 years. He should have adapted by now." Jennifer would shake her head, concerned but not wanting to push too hard. She had met David many times and found him sweet, patient, gracious despite his son's treatment. She never understood Michael's coldness toward him. The children, Emma who was 8 and Josh who was 6, loved their grandfather. When Michael reluctantly brought them along for visits, they would run to David with excitement, hugging him, telling him about school and friends. David would light up, his hands gently touching their faces to see them, asking questions, laughing at their stories. Michael would watch these interactions with something between jealousy and resentment. His father had patience for the kids, but had never seemed to have that same patience for him. Or at least that's how Michael remembered it. His childhood memories were hazy, fragmented. He remembered his mother, Susan, who had died of cancer when he was 12. He remembered his father working long hours. And then he remembered the year everything changed. Michael had been 5 years old when his father lost his vision. It happened suddenly, or at least that's how it seemed from a child's perspective. One day his father could see, and then there were hospital visits, scary adult conversations he wasn't allowed to hear, and then his father came home with bandages over his eyes. When the bandages came off, his father couldn't see anymore. Michael's mother had explained it in simple terms. Daddy had a problem with his eyes, sweetheart. The doctors tried to help, but they couldn't fix it. Daddy can't see anymore, but he's still Daddy. He still loves you very much. As a child, Michael had adapted. He didn't fully understand what had happened, just knew that his father couldn't see. Life continued, different but manageable. His mother took on more responsibilities. His father learned to navigate the world without sight. They made it work, but Michael never asked for details. Even as he grew older, became a teenager, then an adult, he never sat down with his father and asked, "What exactly happened? Why did you go blind?" Felt too personal, too uncomfortable. And by the time he was old enough to really understand, he had already formed his opinion. His father had lost his vision due to some medical condition, probably something that could have been prevented with better health care or earlier intervention. It was unfortunate, but it was what it was. That narrative had sustained him for 30 years. His father was blind because of bad luck, because of a medical system that had failed him, because sometimes life just dealt you a bad hand. It wasn't anyone's fault, but it also wasn't Michael's problem to deeply engage with. As the years went on and Michael built his own life, his father became more of an obligation than a relationship. Someone he had to check on, had to make sure was surviving, but not someone he invested real time or emotional energy into. The irritation grew. Every time his father called, Michael would see the name on his phone and feel a wave of annoyance. Every time he had to drive across town to help with something, he would complain to Jennifer. Every time his father needed assistance with paperwork or technology or medical appointments, Michael would handle it with barely concealed frustration. "Why can't he figure this out himself?" Michael would mutter. "There are resources for blind people. He should be using them instead of always calling me." Jennifer would point out that David rarely called, actually, maybe once every 2 weeks, if that, and usually for legitimate reasons, things that truly did require a sighted person's help. But Michael couldn't see it that way. Every request felt like a burden. Every need felt like an imposition. Things came to a head 6 months ago. David had fallen in his apartment. Nothing serious, but enough to shake him up. He had called Michael, who had been in the middle of an important meeting. Michael had rushed over, angry and worried in equal measure, to find his father sitting on the floor with a bruised hip, embarrassed and apologetic. "I'm fine, son. I just lost my balance. I didn't mean to worry you. You need to be more careful, Dad. I can't keep dropping everything to rush over here." "I know. I'm sorry. Maybe it's time we start looking at other options." David's face had fallen. Other options? Assisted living, or a care facility. Somewhere with staff who can help you, so you're not alone if something happens. "You mean a nursing home?" "I mean a place where you'd be safer, where you'd have support." David had been quiet for a long moment, his sightless eyes staring in Michael's general direction. "I understand," he had finally said, his voice small. "If that's what you think is best." The conversation had been dropped that day, but it hung in the air between them. Michael had started researching facilities, looking at costs, making lists. Jennifer had been horrified when she found out. "You want to put him in a home? Mike, he's only 62. He's not elderly or incapacitated. He just can't see. He's becoming a liability, Jen. What if he falls again and really hurts himself? What if there's a fire and he can't get out? I can't constantly worry about him." So your solution is to warehouse him somewhere? It's called being practical. It's called planning for the inevitable. They had fought about it for weeks. Jennifer adamantly opposed, Michael stubbornly insistent. The kids had overheard one of the arguments, and Emma had cried, asking why Grandpa had to go away. He's not going away, sweetie, Jennifer had soothed, glaring at Michael. Grandpa is staying right where he is. But Michael hadn't given up the idea. He was waiting for the right moment, the right justification. Another fall, another emergency, another example of why his father couldn't live independently. That moment came 3 weeks ago. David had called, his voice shaky, saying he thought he might be having a medical issue and could Michael take him to the doctor. Michael had been irritated. It was a Wednesday afternoon and he had back-to-back calls scheduled. But he had reluctantly agreed. At the doctor's office, it turned out to be nothing serious, just elevated blood pressure that needed monitoring. But in the waiting room, Michael had run into his Aunt Patricia, his father's younger sister. She lived 2 hours away and Michael rarely saw her, maybe at holidays or major family events. Patricia had been there for her own appointment and seemed surprised to see Michael with David. They had chatted briefly, awkward small talk, and then Patricia had said something that stuck with Michael. It's good you're here with him. He won't admit it, but I think he gets lonely, especially around this time of year. This time of year? Patricia had looked at him strangely. Yes, the anniversary. I know it's hard for both of you. Michael had no idea what she was talking about but had nodded vaguely, not wanting to admit his ignorance. Later, driving his father home, Michael had asked, "What did Aunt Patricia mean about an anniversary?" David had been quiet in the passenger seat. "Nothing important, son. Don't worry about it." "Dad, what anniversary?" "It's nothing, really." The conversation had ended there, but it nagged at Michael. What anniversary? His mother's death? No, that was in October and this was April. His parents' wedding anniversary? He couldn't remember when that was. The question continued to bother him over the following days. He almost asked Jennifer if she knew what Patricia had meant, but he felt embarrassed admitting he didn't know something apparently significant about his own father. Then came the day everything changed. Michael had finally made the decision. He had toured 3 assisted living facilities, found one that seemed decent and had availability, and decided to present it to his father as the best option moving forward. He hadn't told Jennifer yet, knowing she would object, but he had convinced himself this was the right thing to do. He showed up at his father's apartment on a Saturday morning, unannounced, holding brochures for the facility. He had practiced his speech. He would be firm but kind, logical but compassionate. He would explain that this was about David's safety and well-being, that it wasn't personal. But when he walked into the apartment, he found Aunt Patricia there. She was visiting for the weekend, apparently, and was having coffee with David in the small kitchen. "Michael," she said, surprised. "We weren't expecting you. I need to talk to Dad about something," Michael said, glancing at his father who sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug. "Of course, I can give you privacy." "No, stay," David said quietly. "Whatever Michael has to say, you can hear." Michael hesitated, then sat down at the table. He spread the brochures out, forgetting that his father couldn't see them. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about your situation, about the fall you had, about your health, about the fact that you're alone here most of the time. I think it's time we seriously consider moving you to a facility where you can have proper care and supervision." The words hung in the air. David's face had gone very still. Patricia looked shocked. "A facility," David repeated slowly. "An assisted living community. I've toured several and found one that's really nice. It has activities, medical staff on site, a dining hall so you don't have to worry about cooking. It would be much safer for you. You want to put me in a home. I want you to be somewhere safe, Dad. Somewhere you're not a danger to yourself." That's when Patricia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was flushed with anger. A danger to himself? "Michael, do you hear yourself? Aunt Patricia, this doesn't concern you." "The hell it doesn't. This is my brother you're talking about like he's some kind of burden you need to dispose of." "I'm not disposing of anyone. I'm being practical about his care needs. His care needs. Patricia's voice was rising. He doesn't need a nursing home. He needs a son who gives a damn. I do give a damn. Why do you think I'm here? Why do you think I've been dealing with all his problems for 15 years? Dealing with his problems? Is that what you call it? Patricia was shaking now, her voice breaking. Do you have any idea what he sacrificed for you? Do you have any idea why he's blind? Michael froze. What? You don't know. Of course you don't know. He never told you because he didn't want you to feel guilty. But I'm done watching you treat him like garbage when he gave up everything for you. Patricia, don't, David said quietly, but his sister ignored him. Your father didn't lose his vision because of bad luck or medical negligence, Michael. He lost it because he made a choice. A choice between saving his sight or saving your life. The kitchen seemed to tilt. Michael felt like the floor was dropping out from under him. What are you talking about? Patricia took a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. You were 5 years old. You had a congenital heart defect that suddenly became critical. You needed emergency surgery, experimental treatment that wasn't covered by insurance. It cost $280,000. Your parents didn't have that kind of money. Michael's mouth had gone dry. He looked at his father, who sat very still, his sightless eyes pointed downward. Patricia continued, her voice thick with emotion. Your father had been diagnosed with a corneal condition. It was treatable, but the surgery had to be done within a 3-month window or the damage would become permanent. The surgery cost $60,000, also not fully covered by insurance. Your parents had about $50,000 in savings, the money they'd been putting aside for years for a down payment on a house. No, Michael whispered, but Patricia pressed on. Your father sold everything. The savings went toward your surgery. He sold his car, sold your mother's jewelry, took out loans against his retirement, borrowed money from everyone he knew. He scraped together $280,000 to save your life. And in doing that, he missed the deadline for his own surgery. By the time you were recovering and they could even think about his eyes again, it was too late. The damage was permanent. He was going to be blind for the rest of his life. The room was spinning. Michael couldn't breathe. Dad! David finally spoke, his voice steady despite the tears running down his face. She wasn't supposed to tell you. Ever. You gave up your vision. For me? You were dying, Michael. The doctors said without the surgery you had weeks, maybe months. There was no choice. There was never a choice. But your eyes. You could have seen. You sacrificed everything. I sacrificed my sight for your life. That's not a sacrifice, son. That's what parents do. I would do it again 1,000 times over. I would give anything for you to live. Michael felt something breaking inside his chest. A dam bursting after 30 years. All the memories came flooding back, but different now, colored by this new, devastating truth. His father learning Braille. His father giving up his engineering career. His father navigating a dark world so his son could live in the light. And how had Michael repaid him? With impatience, with irritation, with resentment, with plans to warehouse him in a facility so he wouldn't be inconvenient anymore. Why didn't you tell me? Michael's voice was barely a whisper. Because I didn't want you to carry that weight. I didn't want you to feel guilty every time you looked at me. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me something. You were a child. It wasn't your fault. It was never your fault. I've been so cruel to you. God, Dad. I've been so awful. You've been busy. You have your own life, your own family. I understand. No. Michael's voice cracked. No, you don't understand. I've treated you like you were a burden. Like you were an inconvenience. I've been impatient and harsh and cold. And all this time you were blind because you saved my life. Patricia sat back down, wiping her tears. He never wanted you to know, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. Not when you were talking about putting him away like he doesn't matter. Michael looked at the brochures on the table, the glossy pictures of smiling seniors in institutional settings, and felt physically ill. He had been ready to do that. He had been ready to ship his father off to a facility because he was inconvenient. His father, who had given up his sight so Michael could live. The brochures felt like accusations. Michael grabbed them and crumpled them in his fists. "I'm so sorry," he choked out. "Dad, I'm so sorry." David reached across the table, his hand searching until it found Michael's. His grip was warm, steady, forgiving. "You're here now. That's what matters." But it wasn't enough. Sorry wasn't enough. 30 years of taking his father for granted, 15 years of treating him with barely concealed irritation, and now plans to abandon him entirely. How could sorry ever be enough? Michael spent the rest of that day with his father, really talking for the first time in years. Patricia left them alone, sensing they needed privacy. And in that small kitchen, David told his son the whole story. It had been April 30 years ago. Michael had collapsed at kindergarten. The teachers called an ambulance. At the hospital, the diagnosis had been swift and terrifying. A congenital heart defect, an arterial malformation that had suddenly become critical. Without immediate surgery, Michael would die. But it wasn't a standard surgery. The particular defect required a specialized procedure, still somewhat experimental at the time, performed by only a handful of surgeons in the country. Insurance companies classified it as unnecessary, high risk, and refused to cover it. The cost out of pocket, $280,000. David and Susan had been devastated. They were middle-class people with modest savings. There was no way to come up with that kind of money quickly. They looked into loans, into selling their home, into anything that might help. But mortgage loans took time, and their son didn't have time. David had been in the middle of his own medical crisis. A few months earlier, he had been diagnosed with keratoconus, a degenerative eye condition where the cornea progressively thins and bulges. He had been scheduled for a corneal transplant surgery, a procedure that needed to happen within 3 months or the damage would become irreversible. The surgery cost $60,000, only partially covered by insurance. David and Susan had been saving for years, planning to pay the out-of-pocket portion and then save for a down payment on a bigger house. When Michael collapsed, David made his decision immediately. He canceled his eye surgery. He took the $50,000 from savings. He sold his car for $12,000. He borrowed $20,000 from his brother. He took out high-interest loans totaling another $50,000, using his retirement accounts as collateral. Susan sold her mother's wedding ring and jewelry, pieces she had treasured, for $18,000. They borrowed another $30,000 from Susan's parents. Friends, co-workers, people from their church contributed what they could. David worked overtime, taking every extra shift available, every weekend job, selling everything they owned that had any value. In 6 weeks, through a combination of savings, sales, loans, and borrowed money, they scraped together $280,000. Michael had the surgery. It was successful. He recovered. He lived. But by the time the medical crisis was over, David's 3-month window had closed. The keratoconus had progressed beyond the point where a transplant would help. His vision deteriorated rapidly over the next year. By the time Michael turned 6, David was completely blind. Susan had wanted to tell Michael when he was older, wanted him to understand the sacrifice his father had made. But David refused. "He's just a child," David insisted. "He shouldn't have to carry that weight. He shouldn't have to feel guilty for being alive." Susan had eventually agreed, though she struggled with the decision. She had watched her husband adapt to blindness, learn new skills, give up his career, navigate a world he could no longer see. She had watched him sacrifice everything and refused to let their son know, refused to accept credit or gratitude. When Susan died of cancer 7 years later, she made Patricia promise to tell Michael the truth someday. "If something happens to me," Susan had said on her deathbed, "if David's gone and Michael doesn't know, you have to tell him. He deserves to know what his father did for him." Patricia had kept that promise in her heart for 20 years, watching Michael grow up, watching him become increasingly distant from his father, watching him treat David with less and less patience. She had wanted to say something so many times, but she had also promised David she wouldn't, and she didn't want to betray her brother. But seeing Michael with those assisted living brochures, talking about putting David in a facility, treating him like a burden to be managed rather than a father to be honored. Patricia couldn't stay silent anymore. Now, sitting in that kitchen, David told Michael all of this. He spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity or blame. He explained the medical details, the financial desperation, the impossible choices. He talked about how scary it had been to watch his vision fade, to realize he would never see his son grow up, never see his grandchildren if he had any, never see another sunrise. "But I would do it again," David said firmly. "Every single time. Because you lived. You got to grow up, got to go to college, got to build a career and a family. You got to live, Michael. That's worth more than my sight ever was." Michael sat there sobbing, his head in his hands, overwhelmed by grief and guilt and gratitude all mixed together. His father had given him everything, literally everything, and he had spent 15 years treating him like an inconvenience. When he finally composed himself enough to speak, Michael asked, "What can I do? How can I possibly make this right?" David smiled, that gentle smile Michael had seen so many times without truly appreciating. "You already are. You're here. You know the truth now. That's all I need." But it wasn't enough for Michael. He left his father's apartment that day with his mind racing. He spent the drive home thinking, planning, trying to figure out how to begin to repay an unpayable debt. When he got home, Jennifer took one look at his face and knew something major had happened. He told her everything. She cried with him, held him, and said what he already knew. "You need to make this right." Over the next few days, Michael did research. He looked into treatments for keratoconus, into advances in corneal surgery, into new technologies and experimental procedures. Most of what he found was discouraging. After 30 years of blindness, the damage was likely permanent. The corneal tissue had been compromised for too long. But then he found something. A clinical trial at Johns Hopkins for a new type of corneal restoration procedure combined with stem cell therapy. It was highly experimental, only available to a select number of patients, and prohibitively expensive. The trial itself was free, but if accepted, patients had to pay for pre-treatment procedures, post-surgery care, and rehabilitation. Total cost: approximately $150,000. The success rate was modest. About 40% of patients regained some vision, usually partial. Full restoration was rare. But even partial vision, even just light perception or the ability to see shapes, would be life-changing for someone who had been blind for 30 years. Michael called the research center. Getting his father into the trial would require extensive testing, medical evaluations, and approval from the research board. There was also a waiting list. But Michael was persistent. He explained his father's case, the cause of the blindness, the length of time without treatment. The coordinator said she would review the file and get back to him. In the meantime, Michael made other changes. Immediate ones. He called his father and asked if he could come over. When he arrived at the apartment, he sat down and said, "Dad, I want you to move in with us." David looked surprised. "Michael, you don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. Not because you need me to, but because I need to. I've wasted 15 years keeping you at arm's length. I don't want to waste any more time. We have a guest room on the first floor. It would be easy to set up for you. The kids would love having you there. Please." David was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Michael and Jennifer converted the guest room, installing better lighting, organizing everything logically for someone navigating by touch and memory. They got tactile labels, audiobooks, everything David would need to be comfortable. Emma and Josh were thrilled. They helped decorate their grandfather's room, picking out blankets and pillows, making welcome signs. They didn't fully understand why Grandpa was moving in, just knew that it meant they'd get to see him every day. The move happened on a Saturday in May. Patricia came to help, tears in her eyes as she watched her brother finally being welcomed into his son's home. Not as an obligation, but as family. That first week was an adjustment. Michael had to learn his father's routines, his needs, his preferences. But this time, Michael approached it with patience and humility. When David moved slowly, Michael waited. When David needed help, Michael offered it gently. When David struggled with something, Michael helped without irritation. Jennifer watched the transformation in her husband with quiet approval. The hard, impatient man she'd been worried about was softening, becoming more present, more compassionate. The kids were natural with their grandfather. They would sit with him after school, telling him about their days, reading to him, helping him navigate the house. David would listen intently, his face lighting up at their voices, his hands touching their faces to see them grow and change. One evening, Michael found Emma sitting with David in the living room. She was reading him a chapter book, something about a magical kingdom. David listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions, encouraging her reading. Michael stood in the doorway, watching, and felt his throat tighten. His father had sacrificed his vision 30 years ago so Michael could live. And now, here was Michael's daughter reading to her grandfather, filling his world of darkness with stories and imagination. The circle felt complete somehow. The sacrifice hadn't been in vain. David had saved Michael, and Michael had built a life, a family, a legacy. And now that family was giving back to David, surrounding him with love and purpose. 3 weeks after David moved in, Michael got the call from Johns Hopkins. David had been accepted into the clinical trial. The preliminary tests showed that while the damage was extensive, there was still viable corneal tissue to work with. The stem cell therapy combined with the new surgical technique had a chance of restoring partial vision. Michael told his father that evening. David was hesitant at first, afraid to hope. "Son, I've been blind for 30 years. I've adapted. I don't want you spending money on something that might not work. Dad, you spent $280,000 and your eyesight to save my life. I'm spending $150,000 to try to give you some of that back. This isn't a discussion. We're doing this. Where will you get that kind of money?" Michael had already figured that out. He sold his luxury car and bought a modest used sedan. He took out a home equity loan. He cashed in some investments. Jennifer fully supported it, even offering to sell some of her own jewelry and possessions. Michael's colleagues at the firm, when they heard the story, contributed to a fund. People who had known David years ago, former co-workers and friends, donated what they could. Within a month, Michael had raised the money. The surgery was scheduled for July. The entire family traveled to Baltimore for it. Michael, Jennifer, the kids, and Patricia all stayed in a hotel near the hospital. The night before the surgery, they all had dinner together in David's hospital room. David was nervous, a rare show of vulnerability. "What if it doesn't work?" he asked quietly. "Then we tried," Michael said. "And you'll still be the bravest man I know. But Dad, I have to try. You gave me life. Let me try to give you sight." The surgery took 9 hours. It was complex, delicate, involving the removal of damaged tissue, the introduction of cultivated stem cells, and the transplantation of donor corneal tissue treated with the experimental procedure. The surgical team was cautious in their prognosis, reminding the family that even in the best cases, results were partial and unpredictable. David came out of surgery with heavy bandages over both eyes. The recovery period would be 8 weeks before the bandages could be removed and they would know if the procedure had worked. Those 8 weeks were agonizing. David stayed with Michael's family, healing, resting, trying not to get his hopes up too much. Michael took time off work to help care for his father, to keep him company, to make sure he was comfortable. They talked during those weeks. Really talked. Michael asked his father about his childhood, about his marriage to Susan, about his career before blindness. David told stories Michael had never heard, memories and experiences that painted a fuller picture of who his father was beyond just the blind dad. And Michael talked too. He told his father about his own fears and insecurities, about the pressure he felt at work, about his worries as a parent. He apologized, repeatedly, for the years of coldness and impatience. David would always respond the same way. "I forgave you before you even knew you needed forgiveness. That's what love is, son." Finally, the day came to remove the bandages. The whole family gathered at Johns Hopkins for the appointment. Michael held his father's hand as the surgeon carefully unwrapped the gauze, layer after layer, until finally David's eyes were exposed. The surgeon shined a light. David, can you see anything? David was very still. Then, slowly, his eyes moved, focusing on something. Light, he whispered. I can see light. Good. That's very good. Let's do some tests. Over the next hour, the surgeon assessed David's vision. The results were better than anyone had dared hope. David had regained approximately 40% vision in his right eye and about 20% in his left. He couldn't see clearly, everything was blurry and indistinct, but he could perceive shapes, colors, light, and shadow. With corrective lenses and time to adjust, the surgeon believed David would be able to navigate more independently and possibly even read large print. It wasn't perfect vision. It wasn't the sight he'd had 30 years ago, but after 3 decades of complete darkness, it was a miracle. David turned his head, his eyes searching, and then they landed on Michael. For the first time in 30 years, father and son saw each other. David's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his cheeks. You look like your mother, he whispered. God, Michael, you look so much like her. Michael was crying too, unable to speak. His father could see him. After everything, his father could see him. David's eyes moved to Jennifer, then to Emma and Josh. My grandchildren, he breathed. I can see my grandchildren. Emma and Josh ran to him, carefully because of the surgery, and David looked at their faces with wonder. His hands still came up to touch them, an old habit, but now his eyes could confirm what his hands were telling him. The drive home from Baltimore was quiet but joyful. David sat in the passenger seat, his face pressed to the window, watching the world go by. Colors, shapes, the blur of trees and buildings. After 30 years of darkness, even blurry vision was overwhelming. Back home, David walked through Michael's house, seeing it for the first time. He saw the photos on the walls, the furniture, the layout. Everything he'd only known through touch and mental mapping was now visible, even if not perfectly clear. That night, at dinner, David looked around the table at his family. I never thought I'd see this, he said quietly. I made peace with blindness years ago. I didn't think I'd ever see faces again, see colors, see light. This is more than I ever dreamed. Michael reached across the table and took his father's hand. You gave me life, Dad. I just wanted to give you this small piece back. Small piece? Michael, this is everything. Over the following months, David adjusted to his partial vision. He got prescription glasses that helped sharpen what he could see. He worked with an occupational therapist to relearn certain tasks now that he had vision to assist with touch. He read books with large print. He watched TV, even though the images were fuzzy, just happy to see light and movement and color. Most importantly, he watched his grandchildren. He watched Emma and Josh play, watched them do homework, watched them simply exist. And he spent hours just looking at Michael, still marveling that he could see his son's face. Michael had changed fundamentally. The impatient, irritated man who had resented his father's presence was gone. In his place was someone humbler, more grateful, more present. He made time for his father every day, not out of obligation but out of genuine desire to connect. He also changed how he approached his work and his own family. Jennifer noticed that he was less stressed, more engaged with the kids, more patient with life's inconveniences. Nearly losing his father, nearly making the mistake of institutionalizing him, had shaken Michael's priorities into a new order. One evening, 6 months after the surgery, Michael and David sat on the back porch watching the sunset. David could see it, the blur of orange and pink and gold, the fading light. It was beautiful in a way he'd forgotten existed. You know what I've been thinking about? David said quietly. What's that, Dad? All those years I was blind. I told myself I didn't miss seeing. I told myself I'd adapted, that I was fine. And I was fine, I really was. But now, seeing again, even just partially, I realize how much I was lying to myself. I missed it terribly. Every single day. Michael felt his chest tighten. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Don't be sorry. I made my choice and it was the right choice. But I want you to understand something, son. David turned to look at Michael, his eyes finding his son's face even through the blur. I didn't just sacrifice my vision for you. I sacrificed it willingly, gladly, without hesitation. Because that's what love is. Love isn't keeping score. Love isn't expecting repayment. Love is giving everything and asking for nothing in return. You deserved better than how I treated you. Maybe, but you're here now. You gave me this gift of sight. You brought me into your home, into your family. That's more than I ever expected or asked for. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset fade into twilight. Then David spoke again. There's something I need to tell you, Michael. Something I should have said years ago. Michael looked at his father, waiting. When you were in the hospital after your heart surgery, there was a moment when we weren't sure you were going to make it. You had a complication, your body was rejecting something, and the doctors told us to prepare for the worst. Your mother and I stood by your bed, watching you fight for your life, and I prayed. I'm not a particularly religious man, but I prayed harder than I've ever prayed for anything. David's voice was thick with emotion. And I made a deal with God or the universe or whatever force governs these things. I said, take anything from me. My sight, my health, my life. Just let my boy live. Let him grow up. Let him have a chance at life. And the next day you turned a corner. You started recovering. And a few months later my vision started going. Michael's throat was so tight he could barely breathe. Dad, I don't regret it. Not for a second. But I want you to know that losing my sight wasn't just a consequence of choosing your surgery over mine. Felt like an answer to that prayer. Like I'd made an exchange, my eyes for your life. And I would make that deal 1,000 times over. Tears were streaming down Michael's face. You're the best man I've ever known. No, I'm just a father who loves his son. That's all I've ever been. They embraced there on the porch, father and son, under the darkening sky. And Michael understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, what unconditional love really meant. It meant sacrifice without expectation. It meant giving everything and asking for nothing. It meant his father's blindness and his own beating heart. Inside the house, Emma and Josh were doing homework at the kitchen table. Jennifer was cooking dinner. The ordinary sounds of family life drifted through the open door. This was what David's sacrifice had bought. Not just Michael's survival, but this entire life. This family. This moment. A year after the surgery, Michael organized a family gathering. He invited Aunt Patricia, some of David's old friends from before the blindness, colleagues who had contributed to the surgery fund. It was officially a celebration of David's birthday, but really it was a celebration of second chances. Patricia pulled Michael aside during the party. You know, I was so angry with you for so long. The way you treated him, the way you took him for granted. But you've changed. Truly changed. I was an idiot, Michael said simply. I almost made the biggest mistake of my life. But you didn't. And that's what matters. Your father is happier now than I've seen him in decades. Not just because he can see again, but because he has his son back. Michael watched his father across the room. David was sitting with Emma and Josh, showing them something in a large print book, his face animated as he talked. The kids were laughing, engaged, loving their grandfather. I wasted so many years, Michael said quietly. Then don't waste any more, Patricia replied. You can't change the past, but you can make the most of the future. She was right. Michael couldn't undo 15 years of impatience and coldness. He couldn't give back the time he'd lost with his father. But he could be present now. He could appreciate every moment. He could make sure his father knew, every single day, how much he was loved and valued. That night, after everyone had gone home, after the kids were in bed, Michael sat with his father in the quiet living room. David was tired but happy, still wearing the party hat Emma had insisted he keep on. Thank you for today, David said. It was wonderful. Dad, I want to ask you something. And I want you to be honest with me. Of course. Do you resent me at all? For what you gave up? I know you say you don't, but deep down, has there ever been a moment where you wished you'd made a different choice? David was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I won't lie and say there weren't dark times. especially in the early years when I was first learning to be blind, when I was losing my career and my independence. There were moments of anger, of grief, of wondering what my life would have been like if things had been different. Michael felt his stomach drop. He'd known, intellectually, that his father must have struggled, but hearing it confirmed was painful. But, David continued, I never once wished I'd made a different choice. Even in my darkest moments, even when I was most frustrated with my blindness, I never looked at you and thought, I wish I'd saved my sight instead, because every time I heard your voice, every time I felt your hand in mine, every time I knew you were alive and healthy and growing up, it was worth it. It was always worth it. I don't know if I could have done what you did. You would have. When it's your child, when it's someone you love more than yourself, you find strength you didn't know you had. You'd do the same for Emma and Josh. I know you would. Michael realized his father was right. If either of his children needed something, if their lives were at stake, he would give anything. His sight, his health, his life. Without hesitation. That's what being a parent meant. I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be half the father you are, Michael said. David smiled. You already are, son. You already are. Over the next few years, their relationship deepened in ways Michael had never experienced. They developed routines together. Weekend breakfasts where they'd talk about everything and nothing. Evening walks around the neighborhood. David's partial vision enough to see the trees and sky. Michael's arm there for support and guidance. Game nights with the kids where David, despite his limited vision, somehow always won at trivia. David became an integral part of the household. Not a guest or an obligation, but family in the truest sense. He helped with homework, told stories from his engineering days, taught the kids about perseverance and resilience. Emma and Josh grew up knowing that their grandfather had made an incredible sacrifice, and they understood from his example what real love looked like. Michael's career continued, but he no longer prioritized it above everything else. He turned down promotions that would have required more travel. He left work on time to have dinner with his family. He took vacations, real vacations where he unplugged completely and was present with the people he loved. Jennifer watched her husband's transformation with pride. You know, she said one night as they were getting ready for bed, I always loved you, but I like who you've become. You're softer now, more present, more human. I almost lost him, Michael said. I almost threw him away like he was garbage. That thought haunts me. But you didn't. You woke up. You changed. That's what matters. I just wish I hadn't needed such a dramatic wake-up call. I wish I'd been better to him all along. We all have regrets, Mike. The question is what we do with them. You've turned yours into something beautiful. You've built a real relationship with your father. You've shown the kids what it means to honor your parents. You've become the man I always knew you could be. On the 5th anniversary of David's surgery, Michael took his father back to Johns Hopkins for a follow-up appointment. The doctors were amazed at how well David had maintained his partial vision. Usually, in cases like his, there was some degradation over time. But David's vision had remained stable, even improved slightly as his brain adjusted to processing visual information again. You're a medical marvel, David, the surgeon said with a smile. Most patients with your history wouldn't have responded this well to the treatment. You must have a strong will to see. I have strong reasons to see, David replied, glancing at Michael. On the drive home, David was quiet, reflective. Finally, he said, You know what the best part of seeing again is? What's that? Watching you be a father. Watching you with Emma and Josh. Seeing the man you've become. That's better than any sunset or any vista. That's what I wanted to see most. Michael had to pull the car over because he was crying too hard to drive safely. They sat on the shoulder of the highway, hazard lights blinking, and just held each other. I love you, Dad, Michael said. I should have said it more over the years. I should have shown it more. You're showing it now. That's all that matters. When Emma graduated from high school, she gave a speech at the ceremony. She was valedictorian, a brilliant student with a bright future. In her speech, she talked about role models and sacrifice. And she told her grandfather's story. She told the assembled crowd about a man who had given up his sight to save his son's life. About a man who had lived in darkness for 30 years without complaint. About a man who had taught her that love means giving without keeping score. "My grandfather could have been bitter," Emma said, her voice strong and clear. "He could have resented his blindness, resented his son, resented the unfairness of his situation. But he chose differently. He chose grace. He chose love. He chose to live a life of dignity and purpose despite his limitations. And when he regained partial sight, he didn't waste a moment of it. He spent it watching his family, appreciating the small things, living with gratitude." She looked directly at David in the audience. "Grandpa, you taught me that sacrifice is the highest form of love. That real strength isn't about power or control, but about giving yourself for others. Thank you for showing me what it means to be truly heroic. You're my hero." The auditorium erupted in applause. David was crying, Michael was crying, Jennifer was crying. Even Josh, now a teenager who prided himself on being tough, had tears in his eyes. After the ceremony, people came up to David to shake his hand, to thank him for his example, to tell him how moved they were by Emma's speech. David was gracious and humble, as always, deflecting praise and saying he'd only done what any parent would do. But Michael knew better. Not every parent would have made that choice. Not every person would have sacrificed so completely. His father was extraordinary, and it had taken Michael far too long to realize it. That night, back at home, the family had a celebration dinner. Emma was heading to college in the fall, full scholarship to study medicine. She wanted to be a doctor, she said, because her grandfather had taught her about the preciousness of life and health. "You inspired me, Grandpa," she said. "I want to help people the way the doctors helped you. I want to give people second chances." David smiled at her, his eyes bright despite their limitations. "You're going to be an amazing doctor, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." Later, when things had quieted down, Michael found his father on the back porch again. It had become their spot, the place where they had their deepest conversations. "She's incredible," David said. "Emma, she's going to do great things." "She learned from the best," Michael replied. "She learned from you and Jennifer. You're wonderful parents." "We learned from you, Dad. Everything good about how I parent came from watching you, even if it took me too long to appreciate it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out. David could see them, blurry points of light against the dark sky, but beautiful nonetheless. "Do you ever think about how different things would have been?" Michael asked. "If you'd kept your sight? If I hadn't needed that surgery?" "Sometimes," David admitted. "I imagine I would have continued my engineering career, probably would have made more money, lived in a bigger house, maybe traveled more. But I also might have become so focused on career success that I missed what really mattered. Losing my sight taught me what was important. It stripped away all the superficial things and left only what was essential. Love, family, human connection. I might not have learned those lessons otherwise." "So you're saying going blind was good for you?" Michael asked skeptically. "I'm saying that even tragedies can teach us valuable things. I wouldn't choose blindness, but I also wouldn't trade the man it made me for anything. And most importantly, I wouldn't trade your life for anything in the universe. So no, I don't wish things had been different." Michael leaned back in his chair, processing his father's words. There was wisdom there, hard-earned wisdom that came from decades of living without sight, without bitterness, without regret. "I want to be like you when I grow up," Michael said with a slight smile. David laughed. "Son, you're 35 years old. I think you're already grown up. You know what I mean." "I do. And I'll tell you a secret. You already are like me. You're a good father, a loving husband, a man of integrity. You stumbled for a while, but you found your way. That's all anyone can ask for. I stumbled badly. I almost made a terrible mistake. But you didn't. You course-corrected. That's what matters. Life isn't about being perfect, Michael. It's about recognizing your mistakes and doing better. You did that. I'm proud of you." Those words, "I'm proud of you," hit Michael harder than he expected. How long had it been since his father had said that? How long had Michael been so focused on his own irritation and impatience that he hadn't heard his father's love and approval? "Say that again," Michael said quietly. "What?" "That you're proud of me. Say it again." David turned to face his son, his limited vision finding Michael's shape in the darkness. "I'm proud of you, Michael. I have always been proud of you. From the moment you were born, fighting to live, to the man you are now, fighting to be better. You're my son, and I'm proud of you every single day." Michael broke down, years of guilt and regret and need pouring out. David held him, this grown man who was still his little boy, and let him cry. "I missed so much time with you," Michael sobbed. "So many years where I kept you at a distance. And we have years ahead to make up for it. We have today, and tomorrow, and as many days as we're given. Don't waste them dwelling on the past. Spend them building the future." It was practical advice typical of his father. Don't wallow, move forward. Take the lesson and do better. Live with intention and presence. Michael took a shaky breath and pulled himself together. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you're right. We focus on now. That's my boy." They sat together until late into the night, talking about everything and nothing. Plans for Emma's college send-off. Josh's interest in joining the basketball team. Jennifer's new project at work. The ordinary, beautiful details of family life. And Michael realized that this was the gift his father had given him. Not just life, though that was the foundation of everything, but this understanding of what life was for. It wasn't for accumulating wealth or status or achievements. It was for moments like this, sitting with someone you love under the stars, talking about ordinary things that were actually extraordinary because you were sharing them together. Years passed. Josh graduated high school, then college. Emma finished medical school and started her residency. Michael and Jennifer became empty nesters, but they were never alone because David was there, a constant presence in their home and their lives. David's vision remained stable. He could see enough to navigate independently, to read large print, to watch TV. He could see his grandchildren's faces when they video called from college. He could see the flowers in the garden he'd helped plant. He could see Michael's face across the breakfast table every morning. It wasn't perfect vision, but it was enough. More than enough. On Michael's 45th birthday, the family gathered for a celebration. Emma was home from her residency, Josh from his first job at a tech company. Patricia was there, along with some old friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years. During dinner, Michael stood up to make a toast. "I want to thank everyone for being here. But most of all, I want to thank my father." David looked surprised. "Son, it's your birthday, not mine." "Exactly. It's my birthday because 40 years ago you made sure I would have birthdays. You gave me life twice. Once when I was born, and once when I was 5, and you sacrificed everything to save me." The room had gone quiet. Everyone knew the story by now, but it never lost its power. "For too many years, I didn't appreciate that sacrifice. I didn't honor it the way I should have. I treated you with impatience and coldness, and I'm ashamed of that. But you never held it against me. You never stopped loving me. You never expected repayment for what you'd given." Michael's voice was thick with emotion. "You taught me what love really is, Dad. Not just through your sacrifice, but through your forgiveness, through your grace, through the way you've lived every day since losing your sight with dignity and without bitterness. You're the best man I've ever known, and I'm honored to be your son." He raised his glass. "To David Harris, my father, my hero, my example of what it means to live well. Thank you for everything." "To David," everyone echoed, raising their glasses. David was crying, overwhelmed. When the toasts were done and people returned to their conversations, he pulled Michael aside. "That was too much," he said, but he was smiling. "You're embarrassing me." "It wasn't enough," Michael replied. "I could spend the rest of my life thanking you and it wouldn't be enough. You've already thanked me in every way that matters. You've let me be part of your life, part of your family. You've given me the chance to watch my grandchildren grow up. You gave me my sight back. Michael, I'm the one who should be thanking you." We'll call it even, then. They embraced, father and son, two men who had found their way back to each other after nearly losing everything. David Harris lived to be 83 years old. He had 21 years of partial sight after his surgery, 21 years of watching his family, seeing the world, appreciating every moment of visual input. When he died, peacefully in his sleep, the funeral was packed. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Former colleagues who remembered him as a brilliant engineer before blindness. Neighbors who had known him as the kind blind man who always had a smile. Members of the blind community who he'd mentored and encouraged over the years. And family, so much family, all of whom had been touched by his grace and strength. Emma delivered the eulogy. She was a doctor now, successful and accomplished, and she credited her grandfather with inspiring her path. My grandfather taught me that the measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they give, she said. He gave everything. His sight, his career, his comfort. He gave without keeping score, without expecting repayment. He gave because that's what love does. She looked at her father in the front row, at Michael who was holding Jennifer's hand and crying openly. And he taught my father what it means to be a man. Not through lectures or demands, but through example. Through quiet strength and endless forgiveness. Through sacrifice and grace. We should all be so lucky to love someone the way my grandfather loved his son. And we should all be so lucky to be loved the way my father learned to love him back. Their story is a testament to the power of second chances, of redemption, of never giving up on the people we love. She wiped her tears. Grandpa could see for the last 21 years of his life. And you know what he told me he looked at most? Family photos. He would sit for hours looking at pictures of all of us, seeing our faces, memorizing every detail. He told me that after 30 years of darkness, the human face was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. That love made visible was the greatest gift. So today we say goodbye to a man who knew how to love, who knew how to sacrifice, who knew how to live with dignity and purpose. We say goodbye to David Harris, who was blind for 30 years but saw more clearly than most people ever do, who gave up his sight so his son could live, and in doing so, taught all of us what truly matters. After the funeral, after everyone had left, Michael stood alone at his father's grave. He stayed there for a long time just thinking, remembering, grieving. He thought about the little boy who had been saved by his father's sacrifice. The ungrateful young man who had taken that sacrifice for granted. The adult who had almost made the worst mistake of his life. And finally, the son who had learned, just in time, how to love his father properly. "I'm sorry it took me so long," Michael whispered to the headstone. "I'm sorry I wasted so many years. But thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for everything you sacrificed so I could be here." He placed a hand on the cold stone. "I promise I won't waste the life you gave me. I promise I'll love my children the way you loved me. I promise I'll pass on your legacy of sacrifice and grace. That's how I'll honor you." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees. Michael stood there a moment longer, then turned to leave. Jennifer was waiting by the car, along with Emma and Josh. His family. The family that existed because David Harris had given up his sight 40 years ago. As Michael walked toward them, he thought about everything his father had taught him. About sacrifice and love. About forgiveness and second chances. About the fact that it's never too late to change, to be better, to show the people you love how much they matter. David Harris had lived in darkness for 30 years so his son could live in light. And in the end, through that sacrifice, through that ultimate act of fatherly love, he had taught Michael how to see what truly mattered. Not success or wealth or status or convenience, but love, family, connection, presence. The simple, profound truth that people matter more than anything else. And that the greatest thing you can do with your life is give it, in whatever way you can, to the people you love. That was David's legacy. And Michael would spend the rest of his life honoring it. As he reached his family, Emma hugged him. "Are you okay, Dad?" Michael looked at his daughter, this brilliant young doctor who was saving lives just like his father had saved his. He looked at Josh, strong and kind, building his own path. He looked at Jennifer, who had stood by him through his worst and loved him into being better. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm okay. Grandpa made sure of that a long time ago." They got in the car and drove away from the cemetery, leaving David Harris at rest. But his lessons, his love, his legacy lived on in the family he had saved. In the son who had finally learned to see. In the grandchildren who understood what real heroism looked like. David Harris had sacrificed his sight for his son's life. And in doing so, he had given them all the greatest gift. The ability to truly see what mattered. The understanding that love isn't about what you get, but about what you give. And in the end, he had seen the fruits of his sacrifice. He had watched his son transform. He had seen his grandchildren grow. He had witnessed love made visible. For a man who had spent 30 years in darkness, David Harris had died surrounded by more light than most people ever experience. And that, Michael thought as he drove his family home, was the real miracle. Not the surgery that restored partial sight, but the love that had never needed eyes to see clearly all along.